teams going back to Korea, and also finally some of the Chinese teams getting to play.
And although the schedule has changed, there are still a few anticipated matchups to take a look at, and a return of the Toilet Bowl Mark II.
The 2.0. I'm Avast. This is Jayne, and welcome to Contested. Welcome back, guys. We are back once again, not live from the Frontier Communication Studio in Dallas, Texas. We're continuing to not be live from there for a bit, I would think, Jayne. And I'm
And
still looking pretty oily. I said, during our pre-pro, without makeup, as a very oily man, it just doesn't help without the makeup.
yeah, no makeup, no crazy. We don't even have our normal costumes, our set design, our studios. You've got lighting and a green screen. I've just got my apartment, but hopefully we have a few more pixels this week. I know that you've got that OnlyFans webcam, but
Yes, I'm glad that was the comment. I'm glad you enjoyed that comment I did.
yeah,
Yes, I'm also glad that we've managed to ship in a couple more pixels into the Jayne camera here today. We
yeah.
trucked it in there.
I like some of the comments. It's like, isn't Jay literally streaming? It's like, yes, but I can't access my stream setup now. I'm just like, way back to the start as if I'm on a video call for school. One of those like 100-man video calls for college or high school. Man, that's gotta suck. But
Yeah, I mean the graduating class of 2020 is gonna be like doing like I saw like they have the emoji graduation where it's all online and they're playing the
yeah,
music. That's gonna be a
I've been
similar setup.
on Reddit. There's just been threads and threads of just like awkward moments in these massive video calls. So we should just have it sometime where instead of just you and I streaming our perspectives, all of the everyone who's watching, the entire audience can just get on a giant group Zoom call just for that premium quarantine experience.
Yeah, just a cacophony of sound from like webcam mics just blasting into your
There
eardrums.
is 0% chance that any of that could go badly at all. It's probably the best idea we've ever had here.
But we have to talk about now that we've talked about our scuffedness and going back to our esports roots and everything there, we have to talk about Overwatch League, and a bunch of teams have gone back to Korea recently. We've had a lot, this past week, they've had to change the schedule on top of that a bit here for these weekends games. Is that, we've had that Seoul is going back, Titans are going back, London's going back. All of these teams are going back. And that's significantly changing the format of what we expected and probably might have to adjust some other things in the future, but it's changing this week's games in particular.
Oh yeah. The amount of changes that have happened and will happen in the Overwatch League, it's not slowing down at all. We've got, like you said, you got the Seoul Dynasty returning to Korea. They're actually still playing 2 games this weekend, even though they are returning. It's not interfering with their play schedule. The Titans and the Spitfire both returning, and they have had their games removed from the weekend because of that. And then some other teams, notably the largest one that's been a big talk around the town, has been the New York Excelsior. They're not going back to Korea, but the stay-at-home order, and of course New York is extremely heavily hit from the the COVID-19 pandemic that's going on, and they're just saying that even though everybody else is playing at home, this is just not something that we can accomplish right now. Playing at home is a little bit more complicated than just logging on to your computer. It's a lot more involved to play an official than it would be to play ranked, even from your home setup. So New York has kind of taken a step back from games for the foreseeable future. And I know that you saw some pretty angry comments about that, but that's how the dice rolls.
Yeah, we saw. I particularly saw a lot of very interesting comments. I mean, I understand because there's a lot of frustration involved, right? We're like, I mean, on top of another team that we're not seeing playing this weekend. Before we get into the whole New York commentary, is that we're not seeing Dallas play again because
And we
probably
actually
because of the
don't have a
change.
reason.
No,
It's
no
not like
reason.
Dallas is returning to Korea. So
It's more than likely some sort of scheduling change there that's having to balance out things. Like that's probably the easiest guess, but who knows, right? Until we get an official statement or when it gets
Mhm.
rescheduled, if we hear anything at all. But for New York, it's like I see fans or people saying, well, we should just scrap the whole season because New York has taken a step back for a bit. It's like, well, we just finally got to the point where we can play games. Like we just
Yeah,
got here.
you know,
We
and,
finally
and
can play.
New York fans are also a little bit on the spoiled side, considering their team is one of the teams that's actually played 6 matches so
Yeah.
far, and we have groups like the San Francisco Shock and the Los Angeles Gladiators, teams and matches we'll talk about later. They've only played one apiece, and then we have, basically the premiere of all of these Chinese teams. We're finally going to get some information about how good are these Chinese teams, how good are their players. There's a lot of names that if you're a really hardcore viewer of like the contender scene or something, you know who these people are, but even then, you can't even compare Chinese contenders, Korean contenders to the Overwatch League. So seeing these guys come in, you can stomp in contenders and still meet your match in the Overwatch League. So there's going to be a lot of questions answered. We how many weeks into the season now, but finally these kind of like preseason power rankings, we're going to be able to test their mettle and see who was right, who was wrong. It's going to be, man, I'm really excited to actually watch the Chinese games, because I'm not as somebody who actually follows the Chinese and Korean contender season or like that scene very closely. I follow the North American contenders one, but for me, this is going to be genuinely my first look at a lot of these players and teams. So content, more
It's
people
gonna
to
be
watch, more
it's gonna
games.
be very, very interesting. And like, you said, like, what week are we on now? Like, I can't honestly, I can't even remember. It feels like it's been like 20 weeks, and
I
I
mean,
don't
I'm
even know.
under this shelter in place order. All of the days are blending together. I don't even know what day of the week it is. I haven't seen
Just
the sun in like
just feels like a kaleidoscope of time that I'm peering
yeah.
through, and it's just merging into a variety of colors. But fans really don't understand, I think, for the New York stuff in particular, going back to that point of like, we have teams that, they were expecting to have like a practice facility the entire year, and then they get
Yes.
sheltered in place, so they don't have that available. Sure, they might have PCs, but if they don't have the proper internet connections within their own apartment, they can't. There's a lot more to playing professionally online than there would be. I'm video conferencing on Skype, and I'm talking to my boss about this work week. It's a very different type of setup required. And you could make the argument then, I've seen the argument made of like, well, why wasn't it prepared beforehand? But it's like, but who would have expected if they wanted that to be their setup? Like, because players themselves or the org could have wanted to have that separation, right? Like, you still are going to have internet, right? They probably have Wi-Fi or maybe low speed Ethernet connections, like wired connections, but they might not have like professional grade. And that wasn't a priority because they had a practice facility, and you have that work life balance, that separation between the two. And you could even still stream from the practice facility as a
Hmm.
player, and that was expected. So it's sure you could argue, well, it should have been in place in the first part, but like when you add in extra cost or extra time to get it done, when you had all the other solutions in place, it's easy to say that when it wasn't necessarily like a beginning thought. And then maybe some players would even prefer to not have worried about that, to have that separation.
And there is I've mentioned this on the previous episode, but there are a lot of people who use like the practice facility, the training facility PCs as their primary PC. The desks themselves are manufactured to Overwatch League specifications. The chairs are the Overwatch League chairs. And this is something that even if you do have a nice gaming PC at your home residence, it's going to be different. You're going to get used to a different chair, you're going to get different desk height, all of these different factors. So judging, off of the Dallas Fuel as well as some other people that I know throughout the league, it is very, very common for people to use these training facilities, in place of having a home setup that they actually use for gaming. A lot of people have PCs where they'll do kind of like, non-competitive stuff, like if they're playing Skyrim or watching Netflix or whatever. But there are quite a few people who, even when they're not doing part of their team practice or preparation or scrimming, they're still using those computers when they're playing ranked all the time. There was jokes going around that the London Spitfire, I think it was, they actually had to put a curfew and kind of like kick all of the Korean players out at like midnight. They're like, you need to go sleep, get out of the training facility. But yeah, they you use those computers because it's not only the setup that you're training on for scrims, but it's also as close to the actual what you would normally be having as a setup when you play on stage.
And there's a lot of finagling in place that has to go by. Like if it suddenly gets to the point where we are moving to an apartment setup, it's like not everyone's ISPs are going to be handled in their area to where you can even get the speeds you want, even if the hardware. There's just a lot of variables in place which could cause an issue like that to happen. I mean, speaking of home setups, I had a home PC, but I only streamed at the office. Like when our office got closed, I had to drive up and load the Envytv PC into my car and bring it back. Like
Yeah.
everyone has different setups, and so I think it's unfortunate for New York. But like you mentioned earlier, they are hit particularly hard by COVID right now. They probably just didn't have the infrastructure in place, and they weren't planning for that because it wasn't necessary. And it's easy to say, well, it should have been there, right? But it's like, okay, thanks, Captain Hindsight, but that
Yeah.
doesn't solve the problems now, right?
I mean, just predict a global pandemic, right? The amount of
Just be ready.
just the amount of contingencies that were in place, I'm sure covered the vast majority of likely scenarios. But I don't think a global pandemic and the likes that we're seeing with COVID-19 was under likely scenario. And there's a lot of adaptation that's had to go on. And so far, I think the Overwatch League has done a great job of it. We had some games canceled this weekend, and I know we're still playing catch up, and we're finally starting to see some Chinese teams, but we still have like 32 hours of Overwatch to enjoy this weekend. And a lot of that, just some of the stories that are coming out from the production team about how they've had to be doing their preparation through video conferencing and setting this all up. Like there's a lot of work going behind the scenes just to get the few games, I say few, but that's such a ridiculous, simplification of the fact that there still are going to be, 12 games this weekend, and they're going to be great games.
And they're going to be going all day still because the Chinese teams that are now finally getting to play are going to be playing early in the morning Pacific time as well.
Yeah,
and
I
we're gonna
believe
have
it's
to
1
plan
a.m.
progress
and
out there.
3 a.m. Pacific, unless that changed. I could double check.
I believe that is correct. But also, lean into our next point in addition to that is that it's almost a good thing that of all the teams that have had to take a step back and maybe had the exact prep ready, it's that New York, because you said they played 6 games. They have played 6 games. They have some room for other teams to play catch up. And though they were going to be in what we were titling our most anticipated matchups for this weekend, because we were really hoping to see the Reign versus New York, or
Yeah, I
versus
was
the
really
Excelsior,
looking forward to that one.
but we don't get to see them now. But we still have another matchup that we're both really excited for, which is the Shock and Gladiators, which have both obviously not played very many games, but we're really excited to see them both play.
Yeah, so the San Francisco Shock, obviously an extremely popular team and an extremely powerful, competent, dangerous. They've got all of the components of a great superstar team. They won the league last year, and they're going against the Los Angeles Gladiators, a team that I think the fans, and especially with Deepay heading up the team, is head
The
coach.
Iron Shoulder himself, yes.
The Iron Shoulder himself. He's always been a very, very proud coach, both of his own abilities and of the team that he leads. And I think that Deepay's got a little bit of he still wants to prove himself. There's the Los Angeles Gladiator fans view him as really quite a good coach. People thought that he should be the Team USA coach this previous World Cup. That of course went to Arrow instead. So there's a lot of things that not only for the Los Angeles Gladiators, they have a lot to prove to themselves, to everyone else, to basically everyone who's not a Los Angeles Gladiators fan. And one of the ones that I'm really looking forward to is that you had John Galt, who was originally the assistant coach for the Los Angeles Gladiators, has now gone over to the Washington Justice as the head coach. Fantastic coach, hoping he does great things with the Washington Justice. But they actually replaced John Galt, who greatly respect for his coaching ability, with Curry Shot, who I think is actually one of the most undervalued coaches in the entire scene. So Curry Shot plus Deepay on this new Los Angeles Gladiator squad. I know we've seen one game from them, but actually going to be playing against the San Francisco Shock. That's where we really, really get to see what teams are made of.
And that one game they did play was a close series versus the Titans as well. So I think that I think it's going to be an interesting series. I think it's going to be a good series. Hopefully, we've already seen Shock do some crazy nutty things with putting like Architect on Ana. We know Krusty's their foresight knows no bounds, and they even did like a 1v1 tournament that was like sponsored a while ago, or I think it was like a couple days ago, and they had players like Violet and Smurf making it like very far against like the likes of like Sinatra and Rascal and stuff like that. So the team's talented all around, so we could expect crazy things to be happening. But we know that Gladiators have only gotten arguably perhaps more consistent than they were before, or even with a higher peak. I guess it's never been an issue of consistency for the Gladiators because they've always finished playoffs here. They've like so far they've never finished below playoffs, which is a huge, I would say a huge feat for the staff of Gladiators and for the core of Gladiators, because to always make playoffs and to always be on that core of playoff potential to make it far is impressive when you even have changing rosters and other teams that are improving or becoming closer to your skill gap. That's impressive consistency. I think consistency is probably one of the hardest things to achieve in a professional esport.
And they're using that as their foundation, and you really want to kind of see it. Is this team that's going to have to, improve to the point where they are consistently like top 3 or top 2 contenders, things like that, or is this a team that kind of use that as their foundation and then really punch up, try and go for that rank 1 spot, which I think so far is not, it's not really that much of a debate that San Francisco Shock still is holding the spot as what people assume to be the number 1 ranked team. Just as a kind of little side story for the San Francisco Shock, we saw Architect playing the Ana in the last San Francisco Shock game, which kind of caught people off guard. But then some news came out about, was it 2 or 3 days ago, that Violet, the normal flex support player for the San Francisco Shock, had ranks 1 through 3 locked down on the top 500 leaderboard.
He's very good.
Yeah, he's very good, and I'm not sure if that's a sign that he's been kind of trying to prove his mettle. Having his spot taken away from traditionally not a flex support player, maybe that hurt his ego or something, and he still has something to prove itself. Maybe it's just kind of Krusty big braining him into kind of trying to kick his ass and give him a little bit more motivation to actually, fight for his right to be a starter. But either way, all signs point to the San Francisco Shock, even though there are these delays, they've only played once, that, they're still probably scrappy and competitive and hungry for this number one spot that they are, people seem to think they're pretty comfortable in it, but the San Francisco Shock, by all measures that we have without them actually playing more than one game, seem to be really wanting to maintain that.
So you're definitely going in the Shock camp for winning that matchup, Shock for Gladiators?
I hope that we see a great match. I think that the Gladiators are definitely going to take a few maps out. I'd love to see a 3-2 victory for the Shock, but it's probably going to be, 3-1. With what limited information we have, I think that the Gladiators probably, if they're going to take a map, I'm going to give the kind of the general strategic advantage to Deepay and Curry Shot, but overall, in terms of just general preparedness with the hero pools and all of that, just on a general level, I think that Krusty and the rest of the San Francisco Shock are just going to be, that force to be reckoned with. What do you think?
I mean, I tend to agree, honestly, at all angles. It's tough because we haven't really seen a lot of the Gladiators play, or the Shock. We haven't seen them play a lot. So it's very easy for us both to say, like, because I'm in agreement with you, if Shock should be favored, but I mean, who knows, right?
Yeah.
And who knows? And we haven't even seen this hero pool we played yet, which is another discussion as we move on. But I think all counts go towards Shock. Gladiators, it's not that it's impossible for them to win. I think they have, like, the one thing Gladiators have always lacked was sort of that oomph.
Yes.
Like sometimes they've had it, like with the run in the 2019 or I think it was 2018 season, I should say, with Fissure. They had like an oomph there. They had the star power that was sort of necessary when Fissure was with that team, and they weren't able to play him in the playoffs for various reasons. And they lost that. And then they get to 2019, very, very good again, but still not having quite the oomph necessary, especially within their tank line, I would say, and even at points their DPS line. And now they've sort of potentially upgraded their DPS, or at least gotten DPS players that may not be as consistent, but have very high peaks with Birdring and Mirror, and also a tank line that is potentially may not be as consistent, though I would say Space is very consistent, but have more peaks with OG and Space, right? Like you have the star power necessary to break into sort of that winning circle, where before you're sort of stuck by, like, yeah, you're always going to be really, really good, but not ever really punching into the top ranks because you just don't quite have the that necessary explosiveness. And I think they do now, but I'm in the Shock camp. I'm in the Shock camp all the way.
It is kind of funny how simultaneously non-descriptive and perfectly suited the word oomph is for the Los Angeles Gladiators.
You need a good onomatopoeia,
Yeah.
Is that an onomatopoeia? I'm not sure, honestly, but either way.
We're just going to run with it. And the other thing is that the hero bands here so it's got Winston, Lucio, Soldier, and Sombra as the hero bands for this weekend. Now, they've been having LH Cloudy play the Reinhardt, where OG was playing the Winston. So actually, you're talking about that OG Space synergy. OG and Space, great friends, duo quite a bit, or at least they did during last year. I haven't seen their streams. Maybe they're still, I assume they are now that they're actually teammates, but they've been good friends. But with the Winston actually being banned, it's much more likely that we're going to see the LH Cloudy matchup going against the San Francisco Shock rather than OG. So that's kind of a disappointment. I do want to see more OG to see how he is faring on the Los Angeles Gladiators, having worked with him in the past. But at least going by what they showed during the first game, it's actually much more likely that we're going to see this Space and the LH Cloudy matchup going against the San Francisco Shock.
Yeah, it just depends on what those hero pools might be. And also, so we talked about the highs here, the highs of what teams are expecting, but we have to go to the lows, okay? The lows of another matchup we're very, very excited to watch, but for very different reasons. The potential Toilet Bowl 2.0, Defiant versus Uprising, Toronto versus Boston.
I want Toronto to be good so badly. It's got such a powerful squad. They've got some great Canadian play, like Agilities and Surefour. They're absolutely fantastic players. Always have been. Hopefully always will be. Let's not have them be washed up or go still water on us anytime soon. They've had some problems with Beast, and their main tank synergy really has not been good. But, Beast's lack of pop off, or he hasn't exactly had the most polished play, but even that hasn't been really enough to justify what has been some pretty horrific gameplay from the Toronto Defiant, which is also kind of surprising because I purchased Stonks in the Toronto Defiant after that Philly match where they took the Philadelphia Fusion to Game 5. They lost on Nepal, but they took him to Game 5, and it was a fantastic series to watch. And Philly, a really good team right now. As much as I hate to say it, they are doing great. So I was like Toronto Defiant. Take them to map 5. They've got a different kind of flavor here than other teams. And in the hero pools, a lot of people thought because they had this more kind of player coached approach to their team, they had Surefour and Agilities, both players who are very confident in flexing onto picks that they think will work in niche situations. People were thinking that if they had such a great performance against the Philadelphia Fusion before hero bans, after hero bans came in, maybe they're really going to hit their streak, hit their stride, and find kind of this little niche where they can really truly succeed. And then they played the rest of their matches, and they had this kind of, again, this more player coach or player centric approach to the game, and it made them look sloppy and unprepared, and they got crushed really hard. So I don't know what happened there or how they got maybe lucky against the Philadelphia Fusion, but it has been downhill for them since that match. And honestly, I'm hoping that this break has been long enough for kind of to pull their heads out of their asses and take a different approach to how they're actually preparing for these matches. But I don't have a lot of hope for Boston Uprising, but I'm rooting for Toronto because I still we saw shimmers of brilliance. They might have been fleeting and they might have been a while ago now in retrospect, but it's kind of like we saw the potential here for the Toronto Defiant, and that's kind of what I want to see. Is I want to see that potential capitalize on. On the side of the Boston Uprising, I'll let you take a shot at what you think about this matchup, but Boston Uprising just doesn't seem to have that same potential that Toronto does, regardless of how the teams are playing at this very moment.
It's weird. Also, before I go on, it's like I also was a man that bought high and sold low on the Toronto Defiant stocks. That's the equivalent of I bought very high. In the preseason, I was like, I don't think they're going to be very good. And everyone was like, no, they're going to be so great. I was like, I don't think so. And then I see them come up, they beat Paris, and then they do well against Fusion. I'm like, oh no, they are pretty good. I was wrong. And then they just plummet.
Like what happened? Plummet.
So I have also bought high and sold low on Defiant, and so I've been burned by that. But it's tough because the Uprising players, Swimmer specifically, has stated that one of the reasons they performed poorly, he thinks, was nerves on stage because they have a lot of rookies. And we have to remember we're in an online format now, right?
Yes.
So there is a potential that when you have some sort of flashes of brilliance from Boston with Jerry, with well, who knows with their tank line really, but at least with I think it points with Young Bung as well, with Swimmer, they have some solid, okay anchor points, right? And maybe some of the problems were just from nerves. And then you have Defiant, which is a squad of veterans for the most part. It's a squad of veterans with they've had success in the past as well, and you find it hard to believe what's going on, and it's an issue of coordination more than it is of skill. When you watch the Defiant matches back closely, like I have, it's always they're just flailing around, doing whatever. I'm like, what's happening here? How's this possible when you have such experienced veteran players? And when you put those two together, it's in the pot here in the online cauldron, and you're stirring it up to get whatever witch's brew that may be the toilet bowl 2.0. It's tough to it's tough to vote for Boston still. It's tough to vote for Boston. Yeah, it's still tough to vote for Boston. I think it's impossible that maybe that they've gone to an online format and they've had more time to play a bit and get used to a wider get used to that larger competition and synergizing possible. But it's not like Defiant have just been sitting around on their hands doing nothing either. So I don't see a universe where I could ever really predict Boston over Defiant. But at this point, anything's possible.
As much as the Defiant have broken my heart, it would genuinely surprise me if they managed to lose to a team that's doing quite as badly as the Boston Uprising. And you're talking about this rookie versus veteran thing. I think we saw a little bit of this with the Team Canada stuff, where Team Canada came into the World Cup, with very high expectations on the shoulders and kind of bombed. That's a euphemistic. They bombed out of the World Cup, and I think that as much as these rookies might be coming in here scared or a little bit too respectful of the veterans, instead of coming in with the mentality that they really want to prove their own capabilities and what they've got, you do have that thing where the veterans could also just be apathetic or be very used to how things are, and each one of these veteran players on the Toronto Defiant are now in a new environment where everybody they're coming in here with the idea of how things worked on their old team, but now they're all on a new team, and maybe they haven't even found their flavor yet, and they've been trying to. But just haven't struck gold yet. So
I
there
mean,
is
you know that if Defiant was having issues with their main tank, as we've seen from World Cup, they still have Mangachu on a two-way. Mangachu can come back for the main tank like he did in World Cup, and
let's
they'd be
do it.
perfectly ready. The
Yeah.
manga tank, as they call it, referring both to his physical stature and to his tank play.
Mangachu is a big boy.
He is. He's a very big boy, but he's
Uh,
gentle. He's a gentle giant.
he's a gentle giant, absolutely. Fearsome player.
And on the concept of hero pools, we have to talk about hero pools now in Overwatch in general, and we do have to, because
do we have to talk about hero bands? We also
we talked about it last week, but I think we have to talk about
technically Tuesday. Days
I
going to
guess
get to that was only Tuesday.
Yeah, it's Tuesday, right?
Yeah, quarantine is messing with us.
But
and one of the things that we mentioned, it was also based off of Jeff Kaplan's 4th anniversary interview, is that they are going to be using these hero bands to be much more experimental, and I think they said disruptive balancing was the keyword. So that prediction certainly rang true only 3 days later. Do you want to, for the viewers who haven't seen it yet, do you want to go over what the bands are for this week?
Woo, the bands are pretty impressive. If you're a hit scan player and you've just emerged from your cave, go Go back into the cave and realize that they have actually, let me find the actual I had them up and I've lost them. I think it was all the hit scan heroes you could imagine. We had like Widow, Soldier, they banned it's not the same format even. It's not even the same format.
It was 4 DPS this time, plus
DPS.
Diva and Baptiste. So people are like, yay, Pharah reigns free. They didn't ban Ashe though. So Ashe is still in it, because I think it was McCree, Sombra, Soldier, and Widowmaker. But Ashe is still allowed. Pharah is still allowed. Ashe, of course, doesn't have a really crazy high pick rate. She's outclassed by McCree in the short range, Widowmaker in the long range, and Pharah is, of course, just dumpster tier as per usual. So it's just
it's crazy because the craziest part too is not just because this is very disruptive. This is about as disruptive as you could get when you're flipping over a desk and be like, we're not even in the same format anymore. Like, and that's the craziest part to me, I think, is that, and we had this exact same discussion last week when there was 2 supports banned. And I'm wondering if we're just going to loop-de-loop forever, and we're just, what is it? Like Madness is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And here's where we're at, is like, because now we have 4 DPS banned and 1 tank and 1 support, which is not the same format from last week. It's not the same format from the week before. And, connecting that to the league is, from all accounts, we are still using the hero pools from the previous week of matches that did not take place, which is the Winston, the Sombra, the Soldier, and the Lucio. Those are banned, which are only 4 hero bans. And now, as opposed to our 6 in ranked that are 4 DPS. It's disruptive.
At the very least, we have another data point, and this data point is to try and determine what the hell Blizzard and Team are doing with these hero bans. And I think it's pretty clear at this point that the idea behind the hero bans for the Overwatch League is trying to make sure that the meta doesn't stagnate, keep things fresh, keep things changing, whereas their idea with bans in the actual ranked mode and in the client for everybody else isn't trying to keep things fresh. They're definitely going for this disruptive balancing, this experimental mode, just to see what happens, trying to judge things in the future play. So maybe they are trying to evaluate where their hit scan, where hit scan lays in terms of power balance or anything like that.
But, and compare it to like Ashe, since Ashe is hit scan that is not really banned, is like maybe they're just really desperate to see what Ashe could be without a Diva or other hit scan.
Yeah, it's just like, okay, we've removed everything good. How bad actually is Ashe? How bad actually is Pharah? This is also before Echo's coming in, so it's not, even if Pharah does show a little bit of success, just like copy paste Pharah for Echo once that's finally released. But you have this system, you have 2 different systems that on the surface look like one, but so far it's very, very clear that Blizzard, Overwatch League, Team 4 just simply has different goals and objectives with these systems. And I don't think that, even though they're called the same thing, we always have to put this asterisk talking about which one we're talking about, the ranked bans or the league bans, because they have separate purposes. And I mean, the ranked bans have no rhyme or reason other than whatever Papa Jeff dreams up for this week, at least as far as we know.
And there can be very different objectives being accomplished, right? And it's a good thing that we covered that interview by Jeff Kaplan, because it's clear that their goal is to be disruptive, and they are being extremely disruptive. They're the kid in the middle of class that's screaming and yelling and clapping their hands, and I'm like, I can't concentrate. I need to look at the hero pools. But the key here is that it's definitely different, and they're probably collecting all sorts of data points that we don't know about. But maybe that's some of the issue, is that we would like to know what data
Yeah.
points they might be
Yeah,
looking at.
they did mention that they think that the player base for Overwatch is comfortable with how the
Mhm.
game has been, and now they do feel like they feel confident enough to be able to kind of disrupt things without really losing a vast majority of the player base. But
That sounds so like it sounds so Mad Max to
yeah.
me. Is it just like where it's like, the populace have grown very comfortable with the rain, my lord. It's like, now it is time. Now we do it. Now send in the 4 DPS bands, and then,
Yeah.
they ride on into town and burn it.
Yeah,
That's how I
I
feel.
mean, what these bands have also been progressively getting more and more and more ridiculous with each week. So, like, I don't even know where you go. Where do you go from here next week? Do you just remove all barriers of all variety?
It would be interesting, right?
It would be interesting. Like
And I
again,
think we wouldn't even.
pulling from that interview, barriers was one of the
Yeah.
things about Jeff Kaplan was wondering about whether it has a long-term place in Overwatch. So, if we're banning all hits again, why not next week just ban every single barrier character in the game and see how it plays?
I think these are like, and it's not that I don't doubt that they're collecting valid data either, is the thing. I think they're definitely collecting important stuff, and they're not just doing things for no rhyme or reason. We say they, we're memeing that they are, but they have some sort of goal. It's like it's like a more advanced species than us, where it's like, he's like, what are they saying? It's like, I don't know. Let me do like a sound and try to talk
Yeah.
to them, right? So I
Yeah.
hit my keyboard, but the there's clearly a reason for what the process is, but I would obviously like to hear about it. But then we covered that in our last topic too, where like, even if they tell us data, then people are still going to be angry at them, like, of what the reasons may be. So then it's almost just like screaming into the void of like, what's happening, Jeff? And Jeff just stares back at you and turns his back and walks away, and you'll never know what his grand design might be. And it's very mysterious, but it's very
I'm sure we'll
frustrating.
get a developer update at some point explaining what their plans are, but probably once they actually have some explanations for all these changes that happen. But in the meantime, yeah, I don't know. So I guess this would be a good time to do this call to action. But every week, we're going to be asking you some questions. Well, not every week, every episode. We ask some questions. So this week, we wanted to ask you guys what you thought about the Overwatch League bans being so very fundamentally different from the words are hard Overwatch ranked bans. So leave a comment below. We'll be reading the comments that we got from last episode at the end, but just as a quick call out now, that if you did have thoughts about whether you think the bans should be the same, should be kept different, changed entirely, let us know and I'll read your comments during next week's episode, which will be Tuesday.
Because your thoughts are important, because it's about the player base. Like, we're very focused on like a league perspective, right, and keeping it consistent. But the casual player base, or just players that aren't as worried about that play, could have very different thoughts about what hero pools are supposed to accomplish. So I think it's interesting to get that perspective. But before we hit our comments from last week, or from Tuesday, I keep wanting to say last week. Time is warping for
Time
me.
has no meaning.
But we have to once again loop back, as we're probably going to do a lot to sort of COVID related problems, or
Yes.
supposed
So
COVID
our
related problems.
supposed COVID related
Supposed,
problem.
which is Valiant announced, or not so much Valiant announced, but their ex coaches announced earlier this week, that they were releasing 2 members of their staff. They had 4 coaches, and they were releasing 2 of them, Stoop and Reprise.
Two very well liked coaches.
Yes.
Reprise is notably he was with the Mayhem Academy, as well as the oh goodness, I'm blanking on the name. It started with an R. It actually did have Mangachu playing on it.
Are you talking about Revival?
Revival, thank you.
Yeah,
That's the
which
one.
is sort of a continuation almost, but not
Yeah,
quite Mayhem Academy.
but a very very popular staff member. Both of these guys well regarded, well liked by their players, both current and former. And take us away, Avast. They had some sad news for us on
I
Twitter.
mean, they said that both of them were released for COVID reasons, citing economics. There was obviously no breakdown of said economics and how that significantly affected their jobs. And it's not that I necessarily doubt that it has, because there is no doubt, especially from not just Overwatch League, but a full esports perspective, that COVID has touched every facet of
Mhm.
esports. And that, especially from a live event perspective, because there are no live events being had. If you're a team that is running live events, whether it be Overwatch League or like a tournament organizer, all of that potential income is gone. And you don't have that ability to run those events at all right now. And if you're maybe a broadcast talent that's freelance, not associated with someone, you're obviously not getting the work anyway. So it's touched every aspect of everything in esports. And Immortals, the parent organization that owns Valiant, has specifically let them go supposedly for COVID. But I struggle to see the reasoning for this myself, because not that I doubt that it wouldn't save the money, because clearly firing people will save you money. Like, obviously in the short term, that's just how it works.
That's science.
But but the workload hadn't changed, right? If you were a coach in the Overwatch League right now, you're still scrimming. We're getting back to games this week, and we will continue to have games for the foreseeable future. That's what it looks like now they've worked it out. Your workload hasn't changed. And this is the same amount of staff earlier on the season that Packing, I'm assuming, whoever identified as I need this staff to run the team, to be as effective as possible. And the workload has not changed with that. And you're still playing, and matches are on from what it seems like, despite some breaks in between. So and then let's say 3 months from now, right? Let's just be optimistic. Let's be optimistic. 3 months from now, we have put a relatively decent handle of COVID on the US, and we can sort of go back to business as usual a little bit, or maybe even 2 months, right? Do you go back to that staff then and be like, hey, like, how was your paid break? Back onto the team. Let's get going. What happens if that staff then finds other jobs for other watching teams or doing something else, and they're unavailable when you felt they were valuable and necessary preseason, right? And then if it does raise the question that these are the straws per se that are breaking the camel's back, that is Immortals. These two coaches, which are generally more often than not almost exclusively coaches, are not even close to the highest paid members of any organization, especially
Oh
if they're not
no.
even head coaches.
I mean,
Like, these
coach.
are assistant coaches.
Yes, historically, assistant coaches especially have been paid very, very low. The league minimum for players is 50K, but assistant coaches are usually down around like the 25 or 30 range. So it's not like these are massive salaries. Like the two of them put together are just barely going to be more than a singular one of their players, assuming they're paying league minimum. So it's not like these individuals are going to be breaking the bank, especially with how much they're rumored to be spending on their CDL team and a few other issues. But, and I hate to suggest this as any other potential. We haven't seen this, or sorry, we saw something similar happening with the Houston Outlaws where it's just like releasing staff. The London Spitfire have been moving in this direction where they significantly downscaled, the expense of their team, I suppose. They went for newer players rather than their superstars, traded away some of their real high ticket players. But the Los Angeles Gladiators is kind of the performance boost to the Los Angeles Valiant, because Uprising Stu, great coaches. They are going to make the Los Angeles Valiant a better team if they're actually there doing their job, coaching the players, working on strategy, doing their job. Is that performance increase to the Los Angeles Valiant even relevant to them in terms of like a business perspective? Because as far as we know, this change that came in for the Los Angeles Valiant was completely out of the blue. The justification was given because of economic reasons due to COVID-19 or anything like that. But, it could just be raw and simple business, that a difference between kind of like an 8th place finish to a 12th place finish doesn't actually matter to the owners or the management of the business.
Mm-hmm. And they could, very well believe that maybe that they're not, that having them there wouldn't change that necessarily. But I still think it's very odd. I don't necessarily agree with it, but because then it raises all these other further questions, right? Because if these two staff members are being such a burden that they need to let them go, right? That raises issues about the solvency of Immortals as an entire organization. When two assistant coaches are like, we have to let them go or else we're going to sink. It also then, comparison wise, if no other Overwatch League team during this time frame releases any of their staff members, that's kind of salient that you are the only team to have released any staff members during this time, right? Citing specifically COVID. And it draws a lot of interesting questions there about like,
Yeah.
what does this mean for them at a whole? What does it mean for how they view their team's performance, the value of staff? Because also, I'd like to say that so far, as we're in our 3rd year of the Overwatch League, and I think it's a story that's been told in other esports as well, is that staff in a league format are oftentimes the make or the break. And that if your staff are able to keep your players in line, because you can get as much talent as you want, but if you can't mold it into something that's workable, it doesn't matter. And staff are the ones that are constantly highlighted, when we build these mythos around teams, as like, the Crusties, Packing Tinsblade, D-Pay, KDG, Pavane, et cetera, et cetera. And if you don't value your staff, then indirectly you're probably not valuing your team's performance, or you're saying that they weren't that valuable to begin with. Like they weren't adding any value, which had never heard anything of the such about Reprise or Stoop. I mean, Stoop had been with them for like 3 years now, or four.
Mhm.
He's been there for a while. So it's just a head scratching move in the midst of this. And unless we start seeing a lot of teams making staff restructuring, then it will continue to be a very weird, exclusionary thing to the
Yeah.
Valiant in particular.
I think one of the just to close put a lid on this one. I think the amusing thing about this is that especially with Valiant's finances and weird justification here is that they actually had to put out a press release October of last year specifically
Yes.
stating we are not broke. This is irresponsible reporting as facts. So this isn't exactly a new question mark around Los Angeles Valiant's financial situations. They've denied it in the past, but going for economic reasons, COVID on a move that just really doesn't make sense and seems weakly justified. We'll have to see more, especially with how the rest of the teams either do or do not follow suit. But for now, unless we get some more information from the organization, which seems unlikely, or Reprise and Stoop clarification, and then choose to so generously share that with the rest of the community, then we only get to take them at face value and see how things roll from here.
Not much more to be said about it. It's just head scratching all around. But speaking of head scratchers, Jayne, we did put out a little bit of a head scratcher to the viewers at the
Yes.
end of Tuesday's episode, which is how are they feeling? What were their thoughts and their feeling about what should be the focus of Overwatch 2? What would they like to see in Overwatch 2? And I believe we got a lot of good responses
We
actually to
did.
that in the comments below.
The first one that I saw was a good comment from the Fanboy Slayer on YouTube, and it says
What a
on the
great name.
it is Fanboy Slayer. On the competitive side of Overwatch 2, here's what I want. I think they should get a bit more radical and go 2-3-2. I know about the server and map balance issues, but since it is Overwatch 2, they should have the bandwidth to make those updates. So he wants to go to a 7v7 with 3 tanks. So one thing about here, this was actually talked about during the Jeff Kaplan 4th-year anniversary interview, where they were talking about the different numbers of players on team, with all of the different kind of things that we previously thought were set in stone being changed by Blizzard, Kaplan, and Team 4. This has come up a lot. Like, what do you think about the game being 5v5 or 7v7? And Jeff Kaplan actually talked about it, that these changes are changes that they could make in the beta, but based off of game engine limitations, those decisions can no longer realistically be changed based on memory allocation and other technical jargon, which I won't get into. So the chance of them going away from anything other than 6v6 right now seems extremely low based on everything we've heard from Team 4 and Jeff Kaplan. This comment continues, says, I like hero pools. They should be 2 weeks long, and they should match Overwatch League, because competitive should try to match OWL. So we already asked about people thought about the difference between Overwatch League ranked bans and the league bans, and we have one. He thinks that they should be the same, and they should be 2 weeks long. I agree with the 2 weeks long one. 1 week kind of seems really quite fast. These metas sometimes take a little bit longer to evaluate, and 1 week just doesn't seem long enough to really find any answers, as players don't really have the full time to adapt to it. Especially if you have casual gamers, people who play competitive but maybe only on weekends, there's the potential they'll only catch it right at the start or right at the end, and not get really much time to actually kind of get into the hang of it or have it develop, because ranked, even though it's not the Overwatch League, does develop metas of its own. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think overall, if I hit it from a strictly esports side, for me at least, um, if we start getting into larger team sizes, we start getting into like a very weird economies of scale. You know, like
Yes.
we're at 6 players now, and it's already compared to a lot of other games, like for example CS:GO or League of Legends, where you have 5 players, it's cheaper, right? Or even Rocket League, where there's like 3. So you always have to bring, when I'm viewing specifically from the competitive side, not so much a game side, that the more players you add, the more money is required generally
Yes.
for everything, and the cost and scale increases. And we're not quite at like the NFL or NBA levels. Obviously, for esports, we want them to be there, and this is a opportunity where we get to be different from those organizations, because we can still compete online. But that's just from my competitive sided mindset and an esports sided mindset. I always find it reluctant to add more people that are required, like not even like backup level or like backbone staff level, but pure just starters on a team level. Adding more just creates more barriers than it necessarily solves, I
And this
think.
is one of the reasons that I actually really like 222 as well, was beyond the balance reasons or anything. It actually really does provide a lot of job security for players as well, because if the roles had not been locked, there's nothing to say that you couldn't have gone to a meta that was kind of like 5-1, maybe 5 DPS, 1 support. Suddenly you have these tank players, on payroll who are not playing at all. Or maybe you have to have that same kind of very large roster to deal with all of the potential meta shifts. So the 222 reducing organizational complexity in terms of substitutes, specialists, as well as giving the players who are currently on the team job security, knowing that they will be playing because they have to have 2 tanks. I think that was also kind of like a really undernoted reason why the role lock was really good, and why changing it might have more complexities, especially for the Overwatch League, than people might think.
And following up with that, I had a comment I wish to highlight as well, because mine's much shorter generally, but it is Gilbot 9000 had this to say, which was, they will never balance Echo enough to make her worth being released for tanker support, which is sort of a tag on to some of the questions we had earlier in that episode. But also, Overwatch 2 should just focus on improving the underdeveloped tank and support roles in PvP, and maybe expanding PvE missions for more than 4 players. So having expanded PvE content where you can incorporate more people, and then developing a lot more on the tank and support roles for the PvP aspect, which is actually something I tend to agree with, but it depends on like what direction Jeff Kaplan, the Overwatch team, and Team 4 wants to go, right? Because I brought up that comment that Sibler made to me a while ago. I think it was in the last episode as well, about like no one wants to play tank or support Avast, and you see for a lot of games that have very easy casual, like not so much easy casual, but especially for esports sides, like they're very one dimensional in terms of like there's one direction the game goes, FPS or MOBA, right? And so it makes it easier to sort of delineate roles. And Overwatch combines the two, right? And it's always been a struggle to balance tanks and supports properly with the DPS role, where you have people that I want to play an FPS, and some people is like, I want the added complexity of a MOBA while having FPS aspects. And so if you focus, you have 2 options there, right? You can either lean far more heavily into the DPS role, which is like at one point we had for the experimental cards, the 3-2-1 with 3 DPS, 2 support, 1 tank, or you could even expand it further if you wanted, like going like something crazy, like you could do like 4, because the amount of roles allowed doesn't necessarily mean the amount of players that can play, right? So you could have like 4-2-2 or something, where you can have up to 4 DPS, you can have up to 2 supports, and then just do 4 DPS, 2 supports, or like
Yeah.
4 DPS, 1 support, 1 tank. There's all sorts of options there to change up the combinations, but I prefer, since this is how Overwatch was sort of made and why people were attracted to it, is to further develop the tank and support roles, because that's what makes Overwatch unique. It's not that it's an FPS, it's that it's an FPS with a MOBA mechanic, and that's like the interesting part of Overwatch. So I would prefer that, where they develop in Overwatch 2 those roles a little bit more, but obviously, who knows?
Yeah, I definitely would like to see, the support and the tank line developed a little bit more, specifically with heroes that have a very, very high skill ceiling. You have that where even just like the decision making on Reinhardt and Winston, mechanically, ignoring Primal, mechanically they're pretty easy heroes relative to heroes like Genji, for example. They have a great, great skill ceiling in terms of like knowledge and decision making, but really in terms of mechanics, none of the heroes in the support and the tank category really have that same level of mastery that can be achieved just purely from operating the hero, the mouse and keyboard aspect of it. So yeah, I definitely agree with you in that regard. Give people more fulfilling heroes to master in those roles, flesh them out a bit, give them more detail and depth. I think that's a great thing for them to focus on in Overwatch 2.
Yeah, and just one final comment too to talk about. This isn't related to anything. Is that Colin Reeves said it was a pretty good episode, except for that I kept. It was very weird how Avast kept lovingly stroking a picture of Super every few minutes.
You really do need to control your
Yeah,
impulses.
I can't. What
Control
can I
your
do?
urges,
The
mister.
World Cup champion, the
Yeah.
Overwatch League 2019 champion. Like what can't? Well, why wouldn't I be doing that? But I'll work on that, Colin. I'll work on that. But that is our mailbag. We put out our call to action, obviously, about what are your thoughts on the hero pools for ranked being different, for the hero pools for Overwatch League. Do we have, is there anything else that we really should cover from that comments? I don't know if there are.
I think we had everything there, unless no, I looked through the mailbag and that's all we had there. So yeah, let us know about the hero pools. What do you think they should be the same? Or do you think they should be different? Whether you agree with how Jeff Kaplan and Team 4 are approaching them. And yeah, we'll see those comments and talk to you about them on next Tuesday at 5 p.m. Central, as always.
Yeah, that was it. Remember, next Tuesday we'll be back. As Jayne said, thank you guys so much for watching. This has been contested. We are done for today. And remember to put those comments down below that we asked for earlier. I'm Avast. This is Jayne, and that was contested.
See you Tuesday.